It was colder than it should have been in early autumn, and the girl's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from the wind, though the Wyoming wind never really stopped, but from something heavier, something she couldn't quite name. She gripped her little brother's fingers tighter, pulling him close as they walked along the dirt road, the last bit of sun sinking behind a ridge. Her name was Grace, but no one had said it kindly in a long time. Most folks just called her that girl, if they bothered to call her anything at all. She was only 13, but her eyes looked older. Too old, like they'd already seen everything they needed to. Beside her, Sammy was only 7, quiet as usual. His feet dragged, and every few steps he looked over his shoulder like someone might come running after them, even though the orphanage doors had already slammed shut behind them. Grace had wanted to cry when it got kicked out. Not because she loved it there. No, that place was more a holding pen than a home. But because now they had nothing. No roof, no food, just each other. And a letter from the head matron that said they were too old, too much trouble, and not worth the space anymore. The gravel bit into her bare feet. They'd taken her shoes when she tried to run last month, said she didn't deserve them if she couldn't behave. She didn't tell them she'd only been trying to find Sammy when the older boys hid him in the woods for hours. That kind of truth didn't matter there. All that mattered was obedience. Silent obedience. And Grace had too much fire in her, even if she tried her hardest to bury it. She thought if she stayed quiet, kept her head down, maybe they'd let her and Sammy stay together. But she'd failed. Again, they walked for what felt like hours, though it was probably just one. The road curved into hills, then flattened out where the land spread wide and endless. There was a fence ahead, and beyond it, a small wooden house with smoke coming out of the chimney. She didn't know whose place it was. Didn't matter. They couldn't sleep in the open again. The night before, when they'd hidden behind the church barn, a raccoon had gotten too close, and Sammy had screamed so loud it almost brought the sheriff. Tonight, she just needed a place with walls. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "We'll ask, but if they say no, we keep walking, okay?" Sammy didn't answer, just nodded. He trusted her completely. That made everything worse. They climbed a shallow ditch and crossed to the gate, where Grace hesitated. There were flowers planted out front, dusty and leaning, but alive. That meant someone cared. Maybe that meant kindness, too. She hoped. She knocked once. No answer. Then again, louder. The porch light flickered on, and the door creaked open. A tall, wiry man stood in the doorway, holding a candle in one hand and a shotgun in the other. He didn't raise it, just looked at her, then down at Sammy. He said nothing. Grace's voice came out thin. "Can we sleep here, ma'am?" she said, not realizing until after that she'd spoken to the woman behind him. An older lady with gray hair, tucked into a loose braid, stepped beside the man. Her eyes didn't narrow like she expected. They just looked tired. Tired in a way Grace understood. The couple didn't speak, just stepped aside. The woman nodded once. Grace didn't move right away. It felt like a trick. But when the door stayed open and the man turned back inside without a word, she led Sammy across the threshold. The warmth inside was the first real warmth she'd felt in weeks. It wasn't just the fire, it was the silence, the safety. There were knitted blankets draped over the chairs, a small table set for two, and a single oil lamp flickering in the corner. The house smelled like old wood and soup. The kind of smells that reminded Grace of a home she used to have before the fire, before her mama died, and her papa stopped looking her in the eye. Before the state came, the woman, who still hadn't spoken, handed Grace a cup of water and knelt to untie Sammy's muddy shoes. Grace's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say, so she didn't say anything. She just sat beside her brother on the floor, the cup shaking in her hands. The man returned with 2 wool blankets and a loaf of bread. Still no questions. Still no names. He set them down on the floor beside them and went back to his chair, picking up a book like none of this was unusual. It wasn't kindness in the showy way. It was the quiet, painful kind. The kind that made Grace want to cry more than if they'd hugged her. But she couldn't cry. Not here. Not yet. Later, after Sammy had fallen asleep curled against her side, Grace sat awake in the dim light, staring at the embers in the stove. Her mind ran through everything. Why the orphanage threw them out, what they do tomorrow, how long they could stay without being a burden. But more than anything, her thoughts circled around one question. Why did the old couple let them in without a word? She didn't know yet that the woman had lost her own son 15 years ago, or that the man had stopped speaking the day they buried him. She didn't know that their grief had left a space in this house, a quiet space, big enough for two more lost souls to sleep for one night. But she would. She would learn that night after night, because they weren't going to leave. Not yet, and not by choice. Because by morning, the sheriff would show up with questions about two missing children, and the silence that had let them in would start to break. And that would be the beginning of everything. The next morning came slow and golden through the lace curtains. Grace blinked into the soft light, disoriented by the warmth, the quiet. For a second, she forgot where she was. The creak of a rocking chair reminded her. The old woman was already awake, sitting by the window with a basket of mending in her lap. She didn't say anything, just nodded when Grace sat up. Sammy was still asleep, mouth open, one arm flung over her leg. He looked younger than 7 when he was like that, peaceful, unbothered. Grace eased out from under him and folded their blanket. She didn't know the rules of this house yet, and she wasn't about to mess things up. The old woman noticed her movements and finally spoke, her voice soft and cracked like dry paper. "There's porridge on the stove. You can eat." Grace didn't move. "Do we need to leave?" she asked quietly. The old woman shook her head. Not today. There were no more questions, just a strange understanding. Grace went to the kitchen and found 2 bowls already set beside the stove. She didn't touch anything extra, just poured the porridge, sat down with Sammy when he woke, and made sure he said thank you under his breath like she taught him. The old woman never asked their names, and Grace didn't ask hers. Not yet. Later that day, a neighbor came by, a young man around 20, riding a big chestnut horse with a saddle that had seen better days. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and had a scar that ran across his chin like a question mark. He dismounted and knocked lightly before stepping in. His eyes landed on Grace, and his smile faltered. "Didn't know you had guests, Miss June." So that was her name, June. The man's name, Grace would soon learn, was Elijah. He worked the land next to theirs and helped the old couple with heavy work since their son died. He had a kindness to him, but also a sharpness. Like he'd seen his fair share of ugly and wasn't in a rush to trust anyone. He didn't ask who Grace was, either. He just tipped his head and said, "Mornin'," then got to work repairing a fence out back. Grace watched him through the window, wondering if he'd be the first to tell them to leave. By that evening, she learned otherwise. Elijah brought in a basket of kindling and 2 fresh eggs from his coop. When June started frying them, Grace couldn't help but ask, "Why is he helping you?" June looked at her, eyes calm but unreadable. "Because he owes us," she said simply. She didn't explain, and Grace didn't ask. But something about the way Elijah looked at June when she spoke told Grace there was more to it. Not just a neighbor's debt, something deeper, something quiet and maybe painful. Over the next few days, the silence in the house softened. Sammy began to speak more, first to June, then to Elijah. He followed Elijah around the yard like a shadow, asking questions about horses and nails and tools. Elijah didn't say much back, but he didn't shoo him off either. That was something. Grace stayed inside mostly, helping June with the small things, peeling potatoes, cleaning, folding laundry. She listened more than she spoke, memorizing the rhythms of the house. It was on the 4th evening that the quiet started to bend. A woman came by just as the sun dipped below the hills. Her dress was too fine for this side of town. Blue silk with silver buttons, hair done up too tight. She didn't knock. She just opened the door like she had every right. Her eyes landed on Grace and Sammy like they were stains on the rug. "What's this?" she asked, voice sharp. "You've taken in strays now?" June didn't rise from her chair. "They're children, Ruth." "Don't call them that." The woman scoffed. "You don't know who they are. I know enough. Grace stood up, unsure if she should defend herself or disappear. Ruth didn't look at her again. She only focused on June. The sheriff's looking. He came by my place asking questions. 2 kids from the orphanage gone missing. And now you've got 2 new mouths to feed. She crossed her arms. I suppose you think you're saving them. Again, Grace felt her stomach drop. June just looked at her sewing. No one's been saved. Ruth left just as suddenly, heels clicking against the wood floor. The moment the door shut, Grace whispered, "Should we go?" June didn't answer right away. Then, no, let the sheriff come if he will. You haven't done anything wrong. But Grace wasn't so sure. It didn't matter if they hadn't stolen anything or hurt anyone. The law didn't always care about truth. It cared about order. And kids who ran from state care, even if they were thrown out, broke that order. That night, she waited till everyone was asleep and snuck outside. She sat on the back step, arms around her knees, breathing the cold and deep. Elijah found her like that. He didn't say anything right away, just sat on the step beside her. "You scared?" he finally asked. She nodded. "I don't want Sammy to get taken back. They'll split us up." Elijah lit a match, watching the flame before snuffing it out with his fingers. "Sheriff's a good man, but he don't like trouble. If Ruth's talking, he'll be by soon." "What'll happen?" He looked at her, eyes softer than she expected. "Depends on June." Grace looked down. "Why is she helping us?" Elijah hesitated, then said, "She had a boy. Lost him during the war. After that, she just couldn't turn away a kid in trouble, even if it meant making enemies." Grace swallowed hard. "What happened to him?" "They say he killed a man in town. Some say it was self-defense. Others, not so sure. June never talked about it much. But the law didn't care. Took him in. He died in jail 2 weeks later." The silence after that was heavy. Elijah stood up. "You need to get some sleep. Whatever happens, she won't let them take you easy." Grace went back inside, mind racing. June had lost a son, and now she had taken them in, knowing full well it could bring trouble again. Why? Was it guilt? Or was she trying to make something right? A few days later, the sheriff came. He knocked loud, boots echoing off the porch. June opened the door before he could knock again. Grace and Sammy stood behind her, hearts pounding. "Ma'am," the sheriff said, "I've got reports of 2 missing kids. Heard from Ruth you might know something about that." June didn't flinch. "I know they were thrown out. I know they were cold and scared. I'll let them sleep on my floor. That's not a crime." The sheriff looked over her shoulder. His eyes met Grace's, then dropped to Sammy. "They say the girl's a fighter. Hit a staff worker." June spoke before Grace could. Wouldn't be the first time a child fought for her brother. The sheriff sighed, taking off his hat. "You got a good heart, June. But the law's the law. I got to take them back, or at least report they were found." June stepped forward. "If you take them, they'll be split up. You know that. They won't survive it." He stared at her for a long second. Then, reluctantly, he said, "Give me a few days. I'll talk to the matron. See, she'll sign them off to you unofficially. No promises." And then he left. Grace sat on the steps that evening, staring at the sky. The stars were just starting to blink through. She didn't know if the sheriff would really help. But she knew this much. Something had shifted. These people, June, Elijah, even the sheriff, they weren't saints. They were tired, wounded, careful. But still, they made room, even when it cost them. And Grace started to wonder, what would she be willing to risk for someone else if the time ever came? The days passed slowly, and though the sheriff hadn't returned, his visit cast a long shadow over the house. June never mentioned it again, but Grace caught her glancing out the window more often, her fingers stilling mid-stitch as if listening for boots on the porch. Elijah grew more distant, leaving before sunrise and coming back late, his voice quieter, his answers shorter. Even Sammy noticed. "Is Elijah mad at us?" he asked one morning, clutching the wood carving Elijah had made for him. A little horse, its legs uneven but proudly held. "No," Grace whispered, brushing his hair back. "He's just tired." But the truth was, she didn't know. Something had shifted in him after the sheriff left. He avoided June, and when he looked at Grace, wasn't unkind, but it was cautious, like he was holding something back. A part of her wanted to ask, to push, but another part was afraid. Afraid she'd lose whatever fragile safety they had here if she said too much. Then one morning, Ruth came back. She didn't knock this time either. She barged through the door like she lived there, her boots clacking against the wood. She carried a piece of paper in one hand, a letter, folded, stained, official-looking. June was washing dishes, hands submerged in soapy water. She didn't turn around. "You're not welcome here, Ruth." Ruth smirked. "That's fine. I'm not here for your hospitality. I'm here to deliver this." She slapped the letter onto the table. Grace stepped closer, trying to read it upside down. "It's from his state," Ruth said, eyes sharp on Grace. "A formal notice. Someone from the agency will be here within the week to retrieve the children." June finally turned, wiping her hands on her apron. "You did this." Ruth didn't deny it. "You think you're helping them, but you're not. You're just delaying the inevitable. You've always lived in some fantasy where you could fix the world one broken child at a time. But you're not God, June. You're just an old woman with too much grief and too little sense." Grace felt her breath catch. Sammy clutched her hand. The paper on the table looked like a death sentence. June stepped forward, her voice low. "You don't know what they've been through." "And you do," Ruth snapped. "You've known them 2 weeks. You don't even know their real names." Silence fell hard. Grace looked at June. It was true. She'd never told them. She didn't think it mattered. They were just names, and names could be taken, erased. What mattered was what they'd survived. June looked at Grace then, her face softening. "Do you want to tell me your name, sweetheart?" Grace hesitated, throat tight. "Grace Allen. And this is Sammy. Samuel Allen." Ruth sneered. "There. Now you've got the truth. Let the state do their job." She turned and left. The doors slammed behind her, but the silence that followed was worse. Heavier. Later that night, Grace sat outside on the steps again. The cold wind bit through her dress, but she didn't care. She couldn't stay. If the agency came, they'd be gone. They'd be separated. She couldn't survive that. Not again. She didn't hear Elijah approach until he was already beside her. "You heard?" She nodded. "We have to leave." "You won't make it far," he said quietly. "They'll be looking." Grace looked up at him, eyes fierce. "We've made it before." Elijah shook his head. "You shouldn't have to keep running." "Then help me," she whispered. "Help me hide him. I'll turn myself in if I have to, but don't let them take Sammy." He didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the dark horizon. Then finally, he said, "There's a place. A cabin. Up in the hills. My uncle's old place. No one's used it in years. I could take you both, just until the heat dies down." Grace's heart lifted, then dropped just as fast. "June, she won't let us go." "She will," he said, standing, "because she knows what it feels like to lose a child." But it didn't go that way. The next morning, Elijah was gone. His horse, his tools, everything. June stared at the empty spot in the barn and didn't say a word. Grace waited all day, eyes flicking to the tree line, to the road, to the fields. But he never came back. That evening, June sat her down. "You can't run." "I wasn't going to," Grace lied. June's face was stern, but there was sadness there too. "He told me. About the cabin. About what you asked him to do." Grace stood up, her voice breaking. "Why won't you help us?" "I am," June said, "but not by hiding you. That only works for a while. And then the law comes harder." "I know. I've lived it." Grace's hands clenched. "So we just wait? Let them come and rip us apart?" June stood too. "No. I've written the state myself. I've contacted the church board, the women's shelter, even Elijah's lawyer. I'm trying to get custody." Grace blinked, stunned. "You what?" "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to promise anything I couldn't give. But I've been fighting, quietly, the way an old woman fights, with papers and letters and truth. But they won't give us to you." June looked down. "They might, not because they want to, but because if I can prove the orphanage broke the law when they threw you out, if I can prove they endangered you, they'll have no choice but to step back." Grace felt like the floor had shifted under her feet. She'd been ready to run, to sleep in ditches again, to beg strangers for help. She hadn't even considered that someone was fighting for her the right way. But the twist wasn't Elijah's disappearance or June's secret efforts. It came the next day when Elijah came back. He was bloody, not badly, but enough to scare Sammy when he stepped through the door, shirt torn, lip split, dirt caked into his boots. June rushed to him, grabbing a towel. "What happened?" "I want to talk to Ruth," he said, voice hard. She was lying. She didn't report anything to the state. She forged that letter. June froze. "What?" "She wants your land, June." Elijah spat. "She's been trying to get you declared unfit for years. Says you're too old, too soft, too." He stopped himself, glancing at the kids. She thought if she could get the sheriff involved, if she could scare you enough to send them packing, you'd give up the farm. Move into town. Let her claim what's left of your father's property line. June sat down hard. "I knew she hated me, but this..." "She's not just angry," Elijah said. "She's desperate. Her debts are catching up with her. If she loses another season, she's done." Grace sat on the edge of the table. "So, she's trying to get us taken just to steal this place?" Elijah looked at her, eyes hard. "Yes." The room was quiet for a long time. Then June said, "We need proof." "We'll get it," Elijah promised. "I'll go back tonight. See if I can find anything." "You're not going back alone," Grace said. "She already hurt you once." He gave her a sad smile. "She didn't lay a hand on me. Her brother did. He was waiting in the shed. She has help. Always has. That's how people like her survive. But I'll handle it." But Elijah didn't get the chance to go back. That night, someone set fire to the barn. It happened fast. Too fast. Grace woke to the smell of smoke and the glow through the window. She screamed, shook June awake, grabbed Sammy. Elijah was already running outside, barefooted, bucket in hand. They fought the fire together. Neighbors came running. Someone brought a hose, another a blanket. In the end, the barn was gone, but the house was spared. The sheriff came back the next day. He didn't ask questions. He just stood in the ashes, looking tired. "I know what Ruth's been doing," he said finally. "Wasn't sure before. But this is too far." He looked at Grace. "I spoke to the church board and the state." Grace held her breath. "They've agreed to let June take temporary guardianship. On one condition." "What?" "You don't run. You stay. You go to school. You let the process happen the right way." Grace nodded, heart pounding. "We will. I swear." The sheriff turned to June. "You'll need to be careful. Ruth's not done yet. But you've got friends. More than you know." And just like that, the story shifted. The enemy wasn't just the state anymore. It was Ruth and everything she represented: greed, power, bitterness. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, Grace felt like she wasn't alone in it. That night, she sat on the porch again, Sammy asleep inside, June humming softly in a rocker. Elijah leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "You scared?" he asked. She nodded, but not like before. He looked out at the stars. "Good. That's how you know you're still standing." The fire changed things, not just because of what it destroyed, but because of what it revealed. Every neighbor in a 10-mile stretch heard about it by morning. Most came by to offer help, hands, tools, even food. But some came just to look, whisper, judge. June accepted the kindness quietly and ignored the gossip. But Grace could feel the shift in how people looked at her. Not like a stray anymore, more like someone dangerous or maybe cursed. The sheriff's warning had settled into their bones. Ruth's not done yet. And he was right. The very next Sunday, Ruth showed up to church with a black veil and bruises on her wrist, claiming she'd been attacked in her own home. Claimed someone had broken into her desk and stolen property deeds. Claimed the fire had been revenge. She never named names, but her eyes did all the pointing. June didn't go to church that week. Grace offered to go instead, just to keep up appearances, but June said no. No point pretending with people who've already made up their minds. Instead, they stayed home, repairing what they could, cooking from what little they had left, waiting for the next storm Ruth would send their way. But the real storm was quieter, and it came from inside the house. Elijah was changing. Grace saw it in the way he avoided June now, in how he worked too hard during the day and disappeared at night. When she finally cornered him out by the pasture fence, he barely looked at her. "She's lying about everything," Grace said. "You know that. So why are you letting it eat at you?" Elijah tightened the fence wire, jaw working. "Because it's not just about her. It's about me. What I did. What I didn't do." She stepped closer. "What are you talking about?" He looked at her then, and something in his face broke. "Ruth's brother, the one who came at me in the shed. I knew him. He used to work with my father. Years ago, I saw him beat his wife once. I didn't do anything. I just looked the other way. I was 16. Thought it wasn't my place." Grace didn't know what to say. He kept going. "When June's boy was accused, when they said he killed a man, it was the same guy, Ruth's brother. And I said nothing. I didn't tell the sheriff what I knew. I didn't speak up. I could have saved him. Maybe." His voice cracked. "So now I'm trying to make up for it. But everything I do just makes it worse." Grace wanted to reach for his hand, but didn't. "Then don't stop. Don't give up on us." He nodded, but it didn't feel like a promise. Back at the house, things were unraveling. The letter from the state came through. Temporary guardianship was approved, but only for 3 months. After that, a full custody hearing would be held. And Ruth had already filed an objection. She had claimed the children weren't safe, that June was too unstable to care for them, that Elijah had a record of violence, which wasn't true, but easy enough to suggest with his name tied to the barn fire. It got worse when Sammy started having nightmares again. He wouldn't tell anyone what they were about, but Grace knew. They were always about the woods. About the time he'd gone missing at the orphanage for hours, left outside in the cold by the older boys. She'd never forgiven herself for that. And now, every time he cried in his sleep, every time he clung to her after waking, she was reminded of how close he always felt to breaking. June tried everything: warm baths, lullabies, even a homemade dream catcher she strung together with twine and feathers from the chicken coop. But nothing worked. Grace started sleeping beside him every night again, even though the floor was hard. She couldn't lose him to the dark, not even in his sleep. Meanwhile, June was struggling too. Her hands, always steady, began to shake when she sewed. She dropped plates. She forgot things she never used to forget. One afternoon, she burned the soup so badly the smell lingered for days. Elijah offered to hire help, but she refused. She wasn't ready to admit weakness. Not when the court date was fast approaching. Not when every mistake could be used against her. Grace began to wonder if Ruth might actually win. And that thought opened up a terrifying question. What would happen to Sammy if they did? June was the only one standing between them and separation. If she broke, if she slipped even a little, the pressure pushed Grace to a dangerous edge. She started making plans again. Escape routes. Food rations. She asked Elijah about the cabin, about whether they could hide there long term. But he shook his head. It's not just Ruth anymore. If the court decides against June, anyone who helps you run could be arrested, including me. So we just wait, she snapped. Hope they see what we see. Elijah said nothing, but his silence said enough. One night, everything came to a head. June collapsed in the kitchen. She'd been up late, writing another letter. This one to a pastor in Cheyenne who'd offered to speak on her behalf. Grace found her slumped over the table, barely breathing, a crumpled page stuck to her palm. The doctor came within the hour. Said it was a stroke. Not a bad one, but enough to keep her in bed for weeks. Grace sat with her all night, refusing to sleep. Sammy curled up at the foot of the bed, wide-eyed, quiet. The next morning, Elijah made the call to the sheriff and the court clerk. The hearing was postponed, but not indefinitely, only for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Elijah said, pouring Grace coffee she didn't ask for. That's all we've got. Grace looked at June, her face pale and still. She won't be strong enough to go. She doesn't have to, Elijah said slowly. But you can. What do you mean? I've been speaking with the pastor in Cheyenne, and the lawyer June contacted. He says you can testify, that your word might carry more than hers. Grace stared at him. You mean go up in front of strangers and beg them not to take us? I mean, tell the truth, he said gently. Tell her what she's done, what the orphanage did, what you saw, what Sammy's still going through. Her stomach nodded. They won't believe me. I'm just a kid. You're more than that, Elijah said. You're a witness. The days that followed were tense. June remained weak, drifting in and out of sleep. Elijah coached Grace on what to say, how to keep calm, how to speak from the heart without sounding rehearsed. Sammy clung to her constantly, sensing something big was coming. Ruth didn't show her face again, but they heard through neighbors that she'd been collecting affidavits, statements from folks who thought June was unfit. Some even signed out of fear. Ruth had money, and influence, and a lifetime of secrets she knew how to spin into truth. Grace almost backed out the night before the hearing. She sat out by the fire pit, staring into the flames, knees pulled tight to her chest. Elijah sat beside her, silent for a while, then said, You don't have to be brave. You just have to be honest. She turned to him, eyes stinging. What if it's not enough? Then we try again, he said, and again, until someone listens. The next morning, they rode into town. The courthouse was small, dusty, with peeling paint and creaky floorboards. The kind of place where the whole room could hear every breath you took. Grace stood in front of the judge, hands clenched at her sides, knees shaking. She told them everything. About the orphanage, the boys in the woods, the matron who hid her when she fought back, about the night they were thrown out, and how they walked barefoot for hours, cold and scared. About how June never asked questions, just opened her door and gave them warmth. She told them about Sammy's nightmares, about Elijah's help, about Ruth's threats. She didn't cry. Her voice shook once, but she kept going. She told the truth, every last piece. When she sat down, the room was silent. Even Ruth had no words. The judge didn't decide that day. Said he'd need time to review everything. Said it wasn't easy to untangle stories like this. But when Grace looked at his eyes, she saw something new, doubt. In Ruth, in the system, in the easy version of a story. That night, back at the house, Elijah lit a lantern and left it by June's bedside. She was awake, barely. I told them, Grace whispered. All of it. June nodded, a small, trembling smile on her lips. Good girl. And for the first time in weeks, Grace slept without fear. Because even if the war wasn't over, she'd finally picked up her own sword. And she wasn't putting it down. The final days leading up to the judge's decision felt like walking a tightrope in a storm. Every step tense, every breath heavier than the last. Grace couldn't eat. June couldn't sit up without help. Elijah barely spoke. Even Sammy, normally full of endless questions, grew quieter, more withdrawn. The house, which had started to feel like a home, felt instead like a waiting room for something that could shatter them all. On the morning the verdict was due, the air outside was strangely still, like the land itself was holding its breath. Grace dressed in her cleanest clothes, the ones June had mended after finding them stuffed in a broken drawer. She combed Sammy's hair, kissed his forehead, and left him in the care of a neighbor who agreed to watch him while they went to town. June wasn't strong enough to travel, and the doctor had forbidden it. So Elijah drove Grace alone, his jaw tight, eyes never leaving the road ahead. Halfway to town, Grace broke the silence. If they say no, if they take us back, her voice cracked. Will you still help him? Sammy. Elijah's grip tightened on the reins. I made a promise to June. I won't let them take him without a fight. Grace nodded, but her heart still pounded. It wasn't just Sammy's fate that hung in the balance now. It was hers too. She was old enough to be placed in a juvenile home, separated for good. And if that happened, she knew she wouldn't make it. Not because she was weak, but because she'd lose the only piece of herself she had left, her brother. They arrived at the courthouse just before noon. The judge's clerk led them into the small courtroom, where Ruth was already seated, dressed all in black, like she was attending a funeral she planned herself. Her lawyer sat beside her, a thin man with a permanent smirk. Grace sat beside Elijah, heart hammering, palms slick with sweat. The judge entered, gray-haired, slow-moving, but with eyes that missed nothing. He didn't waste time. I've reviewed the affidavits, the testimony, the reports from the orphanage and the sheriff's office, he began. And I have questions. He turned to Ruth first. You claim that Miss June Thompson is unfit to care for children due to her age, health, and history of trauma. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Ruth replied smoothly. It is my belief that while her intentions may be good, her capacity is not. And yet you submitted a forged letter from the state, the judge said, flipping a document over. Care to explain that? Ruth's smile faltered for the first time. That letter was an early draft, a misunderstanding, forged signature, wrong letterhead. Not a misunderstanding, ma'am, the judge cut in. And your brother's involvement in the barn fire? I had nothing to do with that, she snapped. My brother has his own problems. I can't be responsible for everything he does. But you're responsible for bringing him into this situation, the judge replied calmly. Knowingly, Ruth's cheeks reddened. She turned her head away, refusing to meet Grace's eyes. The judge looked toward Grace next. You spoke clearly at the last hearing. I believe your account, and I believe the orphanage failed you. But there's something I need you to understand. The law doesn't just follow emotion. It follows precedent. If Miss Thompson cannot legally adopt you within the next few months, the state will seek other options. Grace nodded slowly. Understand. Which brings me to Mr. Elijah Reed. Elijah blinked. Me? The judge leaned back. Miss Thompson listed you as an emergency contact, and in her updated application, she named you as a potential co-guardian. Is that true? Elijah swallowed. It is, Your Honor. You have no children of your own, no criminal record, but your land isn't properly registered under your name. Your finances are limited. Elijah nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. And yet, the judge continued, you supported these children without compensation. You stood by Miss Thompson through fire, public scrutiny, and threats. Why? Elijah glanced at Grace, then back to the judge. Because I failed once. I watched a boy get taken away in chains. I watched June bury him. I didn't say a word when I should have. I didn't fight. I won't make that mistake again. The judge nodded once, as if filing that away. Then came a twist no one expected. He pulled out a thin envelope from a separate stack and handed it to Grace. This came in this morning, from a matron of the orphanage. Grace opened it with trembling hands. It was short, just a few lines handwritten on heavy paper. To whom it may concern, upon review of the Allen children's case and further investigation, I must acknowledge that their removal from our care was not handled properly. It is my professional opinion that Grace Allen acted out of concern for her brother's safety. I retract my earlier statement to the contrary. Respectfully, Matron Elsie Hanover. Grace stared the words, reading them again and again. Elijah leaned over. That means she admitted it. The judge folded his hands. Miss Hanover's statement doesn't change the custody laws, but it does affect the recommendation process. He looked at Grace again. Do you still wish to remain under Miss Thompson's guardianship? Yes, she said, clear and steady. Even knowing her health is failing? Grace nodded. She's our family. And Mr. Reed? She hesitated, then glanced at Elijah. His face was unreadable. He's part of that, too. The judge stood. Then this is my decision. Everyone leaned forward. In light of the matron's admission, the forged documentation presented by Miss Ruth Middleton, and the testimony provided, I am granting temporary guardianship to Miss Thompson, with Mr. Reed as co-guardian effective immediately. Full guardianship will be reconsidered in 90 days, upon review of medical evaluations and continued child welfare checks. Grace exhaled so sharply it hurt. Ruth stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backward. This isn't right, she barked. You're handing them over to a dying woman and a man with no legal claim to anything. The judge turned to her calmly. And you're no longer welcome in this courtroom, Miss Middleton. Any further interference will result in charges of obstruction. Ruth stormed out, heels stabbing into the wood floor. Grace turned to Elijah, who looked stunned. "You okay?" she whispered. He breathed. "I think so." Back at the house, June was sitting up in bed, eyes bright with fever but clearer than they had been in days. When Elijah carried Grace inside and told her the news, she closed her eyes and let out the softest breath. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew they'd listen if it came from her." Grace knelt beside the bed. "It's not over. But we got time now." June reached for her hand, frail but firm. "Use it well." That night, Elijah stayed on the porch long after the others were asleep. Grace joined him, blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. "You didn't have to say yes," she said, "to being co-guardian." He didn't look at her. "I didn't say yes for you. Or June. I said yes for him." He gestured inside. "For Sammy. He reminds me of myself. Quiet. Watching everything. He watches you like a hero," she said softly. Elijah smiled a little sad. "Then I better become one." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, the wind in the trees, the creak of the barn ruins, the quiet rustle of leaves. Grace leaned her head on his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't answer. Just let her rest there, steady and warm. And though the battle wasn't fully won, though the future still held court hearings and medical appointments and maybe more fires, they were standing together now. No more hiding, no more running, just a new kind of family, one born from brokenness, held together by the simple, stubborn decision to keep loving anyway. The days that followed the court's decision passed slowly, like time itself was catching its breath after the storm. The house no longer felt like a place they were visiting. It had become something else. Not just shelter, but memory. Every floorboard, every crack in the porch railing carried a piece of what they had been through to get here. There was still dust on the windowsills, still nights when the wind howled like something lost. But inside the house, there was a kind of quiet peace. June's health didn't get better, but it didn't fall off the cliff either. Some prioritized days, she could sit up in the rocker near the fire. Other days, she drifted in and out of sleep. But she was present. She laughed at Sammy's made-up stories, hummed along when Grace read the Bible out loud, and sometimes stared at Elijah with a look that said everything she needed to without a single word. They were counting time now, not in fear, but in gratitude. Every sunrise was something they didn't expect to get. Every meal shared, a small rebellion against everything that tried to take them apart. Grace had started a routine. Mornings were for chores. Evenings were for stories. At first, it had been for Sammy's sake. He liked the comfort of repetition, the structure of it, but soon they all depended on it. Elijah built them a small table out back, under the shade tree. That's where they sat when the air was warm and June was well enough to walk with her cane. They never talked about the orphanage anymore. Not directly, but it hung in the air between them sometimes, like smoke from a fire long since put out. One evening, as the sun was sinking low and turning the fields gold, Grace sat beside June with a cup of tea in her hands. Sammy was chasing a moth around the yard, barefoot and laughing. Elijah leaned against the railing, watching the boy with soft, tired eyes. "You think they'll ever stop looking?" Grace asked, her voice quiet. June looked over at her. "Who?" "The ones who want us gone. The state. Ruth. People like her." June considered it, her eyes drifting to the sky. "I don't think people like that ever stop. But we don't have to keep listening." Grace took that in. It made sense in a way nothing else had. There would always be people who saw them as trouble, who wanted to push them out, box them in. But that didn't mean they had to keep handing over pieces of themselves. They'd fought for this life, and now it was theirs to live. Later that night, Grace found Elijah in the barn, working on what was left of the broken stall. He didn't say anything when she came in, just kept his hands busy. "I've been thinking about something," she said after a while. He looked up. "Yeah, I want to finish school. Real school. Get papers. Maybe even go to town for lessons." Elijah nodded slowly. "You'd be good at that. I also want to write about what happened," she added. "Not like in a paper or anything, just in my own way. Maybe it'll help someone else someday. Elijah smiled. It already has. She didn't ask what he meant. She didn't have to. That fall, the trees turned faster than usual. The leaves dropped overnight, like the land had decided to let go of everything all at once. June's cough got worse, and the doctor started coming by twice a week instead of once. She never complained. When Grace tried to talk about what might come next, she just smiled and changed the subject. Then one morning, Grace woke before the sun, the house too quiet. She went to June's room and found her sitting by the window, looking out at the hills. She looked smaller somehow, like the air had taken weight from her bones. "I dreamed of him last night," June said, her voice a whisper. "My boy. He was standing on the porch. Said he was waiting." Grace's chest ached. She sat beside her and held her hand. "You don't have to go yet," she said. "I know," June whispered. "But when I do, I'll go easy." "You made sure of that." June passed the next evening. Peacefully. No struggle. Just a breath out, and then nothing more. Elijah carried her out to the grove behind the barn the next morning, where her husband had been buried long ago. Grace planted wildflowers at the base of the wooden cross. Sammy didn't fully understand, but he was quiet for days, as if his heart had felt something words couldn't hold. Winter came hard that year, but they were ready. Elijah fixed the roof. Grace kept the fire going, and Sammy started drawing, sketching everything from cows to clouds to faces he missed. One day, he drew June, sitting in her rocker, smiling at the sky. Grace hung that one above the fireplace. They were never the same after June, but they were never broken again either. Elijah filed the papers for full guardianship in the spring. It took time, more meetings, more questions. But this time, no one stood in their way. Grace turned 18 later that year. She chose to stay, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had everything she needed right there. And Ruth? She never came back. Word in town was that she tried to file another complaint somewhere else and had been quietly blacklisted from working with children again. Grace didn't feel hatred toward her anymore, just a dull sort of pity. Some people built walls to keep love out, and some people, like June, opened doors even when it hurt. One evening, as they sat under the tree, Sammy in Elijah's lap, watching the fireflies rise from the grass, Grace said softly, "Do you think she knows?" Elijah looked over. "Knows what?" "That we're okay." Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked up at the stars, eyes soft. "I think she always knew." And that was enough.